How you doing, boys and girls? Well, time for another week of video conferencing, emails, and other sorts of remote teaching. Anyway, wanted to have a little scenario here for you. Here's Larry the Lobster. He's a good friend of ours. And one day, he's kind of going to the bank here. And the banker's this little sort of hedgehog guy. So Larry the Lobster asks for his money and takes some money out of his account. And he grabs it like so. And he just kind of goes on his merry way. This little fellow here's in line. And then this guy jumps in line. The elephant. And the little bear here jumps in line. And they're all going to get their money too. So the line's getting a little bit longer. And everything's going on, progressing like a normal day. No problem, right? So the little hedgehog here gets this fellow his money. And he says thanks. And he's on his way. And he goes about his day. But then a rumor starts. A bad rumor. People start to think that, well, if all these other people are getting their money out of the bank, what about my money? So then some cell phone calls are made, or word of mouth, or maybe someone's just walking down the street and they were going to go to Starbucks or something like that. They weren't even thinking about their money in the bank. And now everyone's panicking and they all need to get their money from the bank. So they're calling in all their accounts and getting all their money out. So, this guy was going to take out $10, but now he's taking out, all his money. So the elephant gets all his money out, and then he goes away. And it starts to become sort of a panic. It's a little bit like a game of musical chairs, only it's not a party game anymore. It's sort of like a life and death game of all of your money's in the bank, and the bank gets blown out. You can't access any of your money. So now you've got to run on the bank, and eventually, at some point, the cash is going to disappear. And there's not going to be anything left. So if you're last in line, like that guy, you could have problems and you might not be able to get your money. Does this ever happen to you? Probably not. They created certain things to make sure that this doesn't really happen. But we're going to talk a little bit about that here today. So this is about the Federal Reserve System. What is it? Federal Reserve is basically a bank for banks. Where do you put your money? You put it in the bank. I put my money in the bank. Where does the bank put their money? The bank puts their money in the Federal Reserve. So essentially you or I can't put money in there. It's a bank for banks. So if you end up with a crazy situation, sort of like what we had here with our line of people lining up to take all their money out, the Federal Reserve sits there as a kind of like bulwark that can stop that from becoming a disaster. So it's a bank for banks. Essentially, to a large extent, it's going to control money supply, control inflation, stuff like that. It's going to help clear checks as, you write a check to some organization, the Federal Reserve helps clear that. If there's an emergency, like for instance, maybe not a coronavirus emergency, but say a hurricane. Sometimes a hurricane hits a certain area or there's some natural disaster and it just wipes out the electronics. The lines are down. It's probably even here in Pennsylvania, which doesn't have really crazy weather. Once in a while I go out to buy something and the electronics are down because of a snowstorm or something like that. So it becomes a cash economy. If that's the case, the Fed would react to that emergency and they would flow cash out to the local banks in that kind of area. So just the same way that you or I, you get into trouble with money, maybe you can go to your mom or your dad or something like that. The banks can go to the Fed and ask for money. They do control the money supply. So the Fed is a little bit like, it's a little bit like a faucet, I would say. They can turn the faucet one way and have lots of money out in the economy, have the economy flush with money, or they can tighten that knob and then there's less money out there in the economy. Stuff like the situation we described here used to happen. That would be called a bank run. There's a pretty famous old movie with uh, oh shoot, what's his name? Jimmy Stewart. It always comes on around Christmas time. It's called It's a Wonderful Life. It's not about banking or anything, but it's sort of like a family story. But the guy Jimmy Stewart plays is he's a banker, and there's a situation just like this. It's a classic piece of cinema. Normally, when you or I go into a bank, if we look somewhere in the bank, there will be a plaque about yay big, and it'll say insured by FDIC. That's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That means that your money is insured up to, last I saw, was $250,000. So if Black Bart comes in and he's got the little mask on, he sticks up the bank and says, "Give me all your money," and steals all the cash, your money is in fact assured up to $250,000. Last I saw it was $250,000. I don't think that's changed for a while. Anyway, the Federal Reserve was created about 1913. They used to have big crashes on the stock market that would affect people, or there would be a wave of bank failures. This scene of musical chairs might happen in one town, but it becomes infectious, and then the bank failures go from town to town to town to town, and everyone all over the country eventually wants to get their cash out of the bank. And most cash isn't cash that you can touch. Most money, in effect, you can't touch, especially more now, probably in a digital age. You can't physically just touch all your money. It's on a ledger, it's on a bank sheet, it's on a computer screen or something like that. It doesn't necessarily exist physically. All right, another thing the Fed does is it deals with what's called monetary policy. All right, the government, like the president and Congress, do fiscal policy. That's taxation and spending policy. And the Federal Reserve does more your monetary policy. That's how much money's out there in the economy. All right, they can run an easy money policy, or they can run a tight money policy. With easy money, there's money on the streets. It's easy to loan or get loans for various things. With tight money, that's where they're, predictably enough, as the name would imply, they're sort of tight with it. They're not going to loan it out very easily, meaning that it would be a higher interest rate, for instance, if you or I wanted to borrow money. So right now in 2020, would you say it's more of an easy money policy or tight money now? I'd say it's a little bit more easy. Interest rates are pretty low. Just think about it. What's your interest rate for your money in your savings account in the bank? I can almost hear you laughing right now. It's probably real low, maybe 1%, maybe, right? So when you put your money in there, you're not really getting a lot of money back. That's kind of bad in a way. A lot of people don't really look at that as investment anymore, like they did when I was a kid. Probably I could put my money in the bank and get about 6-7% interest on that, but not anymore. Well, that's the bad side. But the good side is that it's easier to borrow money in terms of the interest rate. So, for instance, now when you guys go to college, a lot of kids will borrow tens of thousands, maybe hundred thousands of dollars to go to college, because that's easier now with a more easy money kind of policy. All right. So how do they do this? How do they have easy money or tight money? They do have three tools: open market operations, the discount rate, and the reserve requirement. All right. Some of you guys have bonds, I'm sure. Maybe you got them from your crazy aunt on your birthday, or you got them for your bat mitzvah or your first Holy Communion or something like that. So sometimes kids will have bonds. There's usually a kid or a couple kids in every class that raise their hand when I ask who has bonds. And what is a bond? Really, it's a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that you bought or somebody bought for you as a gift. The buyer gives cash to the government. Governments like cash, just like everyone else, right? They like cash, so they buy your cash. They give you the piece of paper, and the piece of paper is a promise to pay you back later your cash plus X amount of interest, whatever it may be. So a lot of times in books they'll call these securities. It could be bonds, it could be some other sort of device, but open market operations. So if they're going to buy bonds, if the Federal Reserve buys a lot of bonds, then they're going to increase the cash on the street. So when I turn in my bond, I remember my grandma gave me a bunch of bonds for my birthday, and they all matured on my 21st birthday, so I could have cash to go out on my 21st birthday. So I turned those in, I got my cash, and I went and did my thing. But that's economy-wide. If they're buying a lot of these bonds back, they're increasing cash on the street. Similarly, if they sell a lot of bonds, then they're taking cash off the street, right? So if I want a $25 bond, I'm giving the government my $25, I'm taking this paper, there's less cash out on the street, okay? The other thing is the discount rate, okay? This is the rate at which the Federal Reserve will loan money to its member banks, the banks that you and I go to. So if they raise the discount rate, remember, a rate's just a percentage, right? Like 10%, 15%, whatever. If they raise the percentage, well, then that discourages borrowing, and there's going to be less money on the street. If they lower the the discount rate, then there's going to be more money on the street, right? They lower the rate, more people are going to borrow, more banks are going to borrow, more money out there in the economy. So the last thing here is the reserve requirement. Did you ever hear your folks or maybe somebody else tell you that you should save 10% of your money, or I don't know, 20% of your money, and just keep it in the bank, just always save a little bit? Well, the Federal Reserve does that too. Does that to its member banks, and the member banks have what's called a reserve requirement. They're required to put in, say, 10% or 15% of their money that comes from us, regular people. So if the Fed raises the reserve requirement and in essence makes those banks put more or a higher percentage of their money in, then there's going to be less money out on the street, right? If they lower the reserve requirement, then there's going to be more cash out on the street, okay? And all this ties into something we call the prime rate. The prime rate would be really the lowest possible rate, basically, that we regular people out in the economy can borrow money for. So this ties in with a lot of other things we've been looking at, like inflation, which is the rising of prices economy-wide over the years. Also, there's deflation. I don't think any of us have really experienced deflation, but if you look at the Depression, and you could get a full plate lunch for 25 cents or something like that. You think, wow, that was great. Well, not necessarily. The Fed in essence, they shut down that money supply to the economy. They were afraid to have out of control inflation. So instead they had deflation, and that was also bad too. That was no cake either. That wasn't great either. So like the same way some of us are walking down the street or down the hallway at school or someplace like that, and we see a penny on the ground. Some people don't pick up a penny, like, yeah, whatever, it's 30, I don't need it. I just keep walking. But if it was the Depression when they experienced deflation, you're picking it up. You're maybe pushing somebody out of the way to get that penny. That penny was a big deal because there was not a lot of money out in the economy. Anyway, boys and girls, this is just a quick rundown on the Federal Reserve. I can always give you guys reading and stuff like that might expand it or go into more detail in some areas, but that's just kind of a basic rundown. And that'll be it for today. Thanks. Bye-bye.